Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Sami, and welcome at another episode of AI Talks Live. And today we have another speaker. I'm glad to introduce Emma Beauxis. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
Very good. Great weather makes me happy.
Exactly. I think everyone gets happy when the sun is shining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Just give me a second. My name is Sam. Some delay on the stream. Emma, introduce yourself. Who are you? Where are you based? And what do you do for day-to-day work?
Who am I? That's a big question. Should I say I'm French? And that would explain my complex name. I have a background in several disciplines. I like to cross disciplines. So I studied graphic design, industrial design, but also computer science, distributed system, and then I did a PhD in artificial intelligence about classification, error, and biases. And now I work at the Digital Society School of Amsterdam University of Applied Science, and we are a relatively new group that try to tackle a big problem with tech and society and address the sustainable development goal of the UN. So we try to apply tech for the best interest of everyone. And we like to think big and start small. And for this project, we did think big and started small.
Okay. Yeah, well, you're going to talk today about a chatbot against cyberbullies or abusive chatters. I'm really looking forward to a solution for that, because if you go through Twitter, sometimes the messages that you see that people are commenting on is like, are you children or what? Become a bit more adult. So yeah, platform is yours. I'm going to share your screen with everyone.
Yeah, very nice. I like this kind of effects. So now let me start with the presentation. Thank you for mentioning that you two, you have experienced some form of abuse, or mild or severe. And it's interesting what you say on trying to understand who is this person writing me this. And that's a good introduction to talk about cyberbullies in general, because it can impact every one of us, even to a mild degree. And first, let me introduce the team that I had the chance to work with. We had 3 interns that came at the Digital Society School for 5 months, and they were supervised by my colleague Abdul. His full name is Abdurrahman Hassan. And the 3 team members were all female, Maxime, Hilary, and Zara. And Mahrit also helped with the supervision. So, what about cyberbullying? What are we talking about? Well, there are many definitions and types, but we can already start to think about cyberbullying in the sense that it has a target that can be because of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, or their religion, how they look like, how old they are, or it can be because they are some of your schoolmates. And we can also think of what are the consequences of cyberbullying. And it's not just kids play or old kids play when you're still an adult and you behave like a kid, like you were mentioning, Sammy. It has very deep and long-lasting effects on the victims. It can create depression, anxiety, and even suicide. And these effects you can see in the short term and in the long term as well. Same as addiction and panic attack and problem with anger and dealing with conflicts. And then it impacts people's self-esteem, and people can become distressed, meaning hopeless and on the verge of suicide. And finally, truancy for instances of abuse when children are still going to school, it impacts their school results. it is very hard to define cyberbullying, but I like to refer to this definition that that states what is the intention of the activity. So the intention is to be hostile and aggressive and to inflict harm or discomfort. So it is still, even with that definition, it remains still very hard for some gray area of when is it just a mild provocation or it's clearly abuse. But at least we have some elements to qualify abuse. And then next question we're asking ourselves is, what can we do with it? Should we send the army or the cyber bullies and really attack them? Well, I don't think responding to abuse with, or to violence with violence will help anything. But first, let's start to see what is done right now. So right now, most interventions are focused on supporting the victim and help the victims deal with their emotions. And the technical solution in terms of what kind of tech or AI we can use, it remains limited to detecting abuses and hide them when they occur, or not show them to a lot of accounts, so you would not have them in your Twitter feed, for instance. Abusers sometimes are blocked. They are banned from posting any message for a certain amount of time. Or people can block abusers, definitely. And they can set bots to block abusers automatically on their own. And finally, sometimes there are systems that reply to the abusers with one single message. And we think that the potential of chatbots is unexplored. We can do more than replying with a single message. We can try to build a conversation to work on the behavior of the bully and be more centered on the bully than just sending the army to block them or block their tweets. But then, what can we tell abusers if we start talking to them? So we thought of a few initial approaches. First, we could educate abusers. We could talk to them about other more positive behaviors that they could have. We could also think of maybe the abuser has personal issues and insecurity, and then maybe we should talk to abusers like they need help as well. Of course, without trying to make them feel bad and provoke them. We could also work on developing the empathy of abusers, their empathy for their victims, because they might not realize exactly what it means to the people they talk to and the long-term or short-term impact it can have. And in general, we can point abusers to some form of social intelligence that would be more developed. So sell them different behaviors that would make them feel better about themselves, maybe. That was the first approach. Another approach is quite the opposite. This time, we're not trying to play friends or take the abusers by the hand, but we're trying to deter them, to scare them up, to explain what would be the legal consequences of harassment and hate speech, for instance, that are protected by the law in some countries. And every country has different protections by the law, and that's also a different. That's also a difficult aspect of this strategy and fighting abuse in general, is that the definition of abuse in the law are difficult to match with the instances of abuse on Twitter, for instance, or on social media. And therefore, it's extremely difficult to sue abusers, to take them to court and gather evidence for it. There are cases that are blatantly illegal and that have been brought to court, but there are also a lot of other cases that are more in the gray area in terms of what is defined in the law. But yet, we can still try to scare abusers by explaining what could be the legal consequences of their behavior, or the consequences such as being banned off the platform. And finally, another strategy, just to get a little bit smart, maybe, we can think of just trying to keep abusers busy with the chatbot themselves and not with real people. So maybe we will not manage to educate them or to deter them. But if we keep them interacting with the chatbot, at least they're not interacting with others and they're abusing a machine rather than abusing real people. So that's our 3 initial strategy, and I'll come back to that later. And to put that into practice, we need a lot of research to design and evaluate the dialogues that we could have. And we will need all sorts of domain to be involved in the design, to consider all sorts of aspects, both in terms of the psychology of abusers and victims and bystanders, but also the social phenomena around online platforms. And so far in this project, we just aim to develop a framework that could support this kind of research and start to build the basic technological blocks to allow other people to continue experiment with chatbots. And to do that, we identify, we had 3 main tasks. First is to develop a means to detect and classify abuses. So among all the tweets, for instance, that we could find. Oh yeah, maybe I forgot to mention that we primarily focused on Twitter because it's easier to deploy a bot on this platform. So among all the tweets that we could detect what kind of abuse they are, can we also classify the level of abuse? Is it severe? Is it mild? And then we would need to have a platform to monitor abuse before and during and after a dialogue. And then we would need also platforms to test the chatbots and host different kinds of chatbots and make variations in the dialogue. And some of the I mentioned that, sorry. So first I want to give a little bit of background about what are the cyberbullies, who are they, and how can we understand their behaviors. So I'm going to point at some research that has been done in psychology. So one thing is a social learning theory. So it explains how abusive behavior might emerge, and it considers that abusers have first witnessed abuses by their peers. It could be people in their family, for instance, their own parent, it can be an older brother or an older person in their vicinity. And they have witnessed that the aggression was rewarding. And based on that, they develop a mental model where aggression is a good option to get a reward or achieve a goal. So it's something that is learned socially. Abuse is a social learning process. There is then the coercion theory, where instead of learning by seeing abuses, it's a learning process where abusers would escalate pressure they put on their peers to see, like, if I push further, would it work then? And as that work, most of the time, maybe not always, but still, has that tend to work, then abuse is considered as a source of reward and a successful strategy. Finally, something a little bit different is attribution theory, that focus on what is the abuser perception of the environment and how that environment led the abusers to respond aggressively. And it makes the interesting consideration on maybe abusers who are hostile, that maybe they feel hostility themselves. And some researchers have identified that indeed there is an exaggerated perception of hostility by the abusers. So sometimes it's not necessarily that abusers want to start an aggressive or hostile environment. It can be that they already feel as such, maybe because of past trauma or insecurity. So now that we have some strategies and background knowledge on psychology to design dialogues with abusers, we also have to wonder what could go wrong in our project. And a bunch of things. So first, having chatbots may add to abusers' motivations in the sense that they can take it as a challenge, or if they see that there is a response, maybe it would motivate them to escalate their abuse to be the winner, for instance. Chatbot may then worsen the abuse, make them more frequent or intense, especially, for instance, if the chatbot is identified as a chatbot, it has a profile as being a bot and doesn't try to impersonate a human. Maybe it would trigger abuser to have some kind of game with the chatbot and try to trigger the chatbot as often as possible. Then, if we have such chatbot technologies, it can also be used by the enemy, so to say. It can be used by abusers themselves. Well, it's not really something that we can do much about at our scale, but we still have to think about that when we deliver our code. Well, so far we haven't made any groundbreaking AI technology, so we haven't provided some tech that would add to the weapons of abusers, but still we should always think about that. And then chatbots may be totally uninteresting for abusers, and so we won't have any impact on them. And finally, chatbots themselves can become abusive in different ways. One very simple way is that we might detect an innocent dialogue, an innocent message as being abusive, and then we'll target innocent and ask them, are they racist? Do they have a problem with certain groups of people? And that itself can be a bit aggressive. And then if we try to personalize the dialogue, for instance, to avoid the point I mentioned above, that maybe our chatbots will not be interesting and be totally ignored, and maybe we can try to personalize them to call abusers personally, to mention, to cite what they have just been saying. And we could do even more elaborate forms of personalization, like having a chatbot that learns from its interaction with abusers. But if we do that, we run the risk that abusers will try to retro-engineer our system and train our chatbot to respond aggressively. For instance, if our chatbot simply states the statement of abuser or recognize a particular term that is very abusive and cites it again, then people could try to make the chatbot use some abusive language and build sentence, and have our chatbot building sentences that turned abusive themselves. And there was a famous case of such chatbot becoming abusive that was developed by Microsoft. And I'm really sorry I don't remember the name, but TAY, T-A-Y, Microsoft TAY. That became very, very quickly, in a couple of days, racist and having very, very offensive racist and Nazi comments, and had to be taken online immediately. So that might be my last point about this slide. We must always monitor what's happening with our chatbot in case any of those things that could go wrong would actually happen. And then there are some high-level questions that we ask ourselves before designing our chatbot. For instance, about the consent. Is it okay to intervene without asking a victim's consent? At first we did that, but we had only a very small experiment. So we considered that for the small experiment we made, it was okay not to ask for consent, and also because we were closely monitoring the interaction with the chatbot. So in case a victim would give some feedback that would indicate that the dialogue is not welcome, we would stop it immediately. Is it okay to pretend that the chatbot is a real person? Well, the profile we would build for the chatbot would greatly influence the impact a chatbot would have. We did initial tests with a chatbot impersonating a white young male and a chatbot not impersonating any human, just stating I am a chatbot. And we did observe very different responses, like more responses for the human than for the chatbot. So it can be an advantage to play with personas with the chatbot. Should we have the chatbot having the same profile as the abusers, or the profile as the victim, or another profile? But still, there is some ethical question around it, because when we have a chatbot impersonating a human, in general, when we have machines impersonating human, it is dishonest. So some ethicists recommend that we clearly indicate when an AI is an AI, and it's an AI that impersonates a human, but it remains an AI. Then we can also wonder that if we have our chatbot impersonating a stereotype of a victim, to maybe to develop the empathy of the abusers, maybe that would be also really difficult to do, because we can perpetuate biases in society. And then finally, is it okay to provoke abusers? To what degree should we provoke abusers? We could challenge their lack of social intelligence, maybe question their psychological issues, and like I said earlier, consider that they too needed help, or could become better, have better behavior. But we could have interventions that are more or less provocating, but there would be a certain degree of provocation if we want to change behavior of abusers. So we have to wonder how can the chatbot's messages be interpreted by the victim, and be very careful that we do not create more harm to the abusers themselves as well, especially that sometimes our system, or automated system, might detect something that is not abuse as abuse. So we have to balance how hard we make our dialogue for abusers, also to account for the case that sometimes we will have false positive and talk to innocent people. So this is all very, very difficult. And I just began to mention the complications that could arise. So we can wonder, should we even try? And yes, I think we should, for at least one reason, is that inaction, as Mishna was saying, who wrote a very interesting book about how to address abuses, and I definitely recommend it. She states that inaction, like doing nothing, is not simply losing an opportunity. It actually leads to making more harm, because it is a stance in itself. If nobody reacts, it means that it is socially acceptable. At least in practice, it is socially accepted, these abuses. So that motivates us to try at least to show that some behaviors should not be accepted and acceptable. So we tried to do something. What did we try? So we had a project for 5 months. It's a short project, but like I was saying, we think big and we start small. And so our goal was to have a system to detect abuse, and we could reuse existing data set and models and combine them. We tried to measure abuse for evaluating our intervention. How successful was our chatbots? And we also worked on having strategies to reduce abusive behavior. So what could be the different approaches to think about the dialogues we could have? And then finally, we designed and tested several dialogues, And we kept in mind in the process of design and testing the dialogue that we must be inclusive of all sorts of values, social norms, of both victims and abusers, and also bystanders, and we must work in the best interest of all these different social groups. And in this process of designing chatbots, maybe we run into all sorts of technical and philosophical issues, but in the process, I can tell you in advance, there will be a bonus about what we managed to design, and it would be something that would fit very well the lockdown situation. So wait for it. Okay, let's start with talking more about what we managed to do to detect and rank abuse depending on their severity, for instance. So detecting abuse, it is very, very difficult. Like any kind of system, it tries to model something real, like a real horse, and in the end you have some kind of scrambled picture that is not perfect, but might still be useful. And there are a bunch of difficulties to address. First is problem with the terminology and the different cultures around those terminology. So abusive language can vary a lot depending on the communities and who's saying those terms and the types of abuse they refer to. So the terminology is a problem, especially because all this AI, all this chatbot technology, they rely on natural language processing, for which the basic information are words. So if the terminology is difficult, it already makes, for humans, it already makes it difficult for technology to learn them. Then obtaining ground truth data, which is collection of sample of abuses that are labeled, okay, this is abuse, this is not abuse. Collecting those samples is very hard because we need to represent the diversity of abuse, the diversity of terminology and types of abuse, and it will take a lot of time. And also labeling abuse is difficult for humans as well. It's prone to interpretation. Some people might have harder skin and think, oh no, that is not abuse, but for other people it can be still very offensive or hurting. And then humans have disagreement on what should be considered abuse or what should be severity of abuse. And finally, there are pre-trained models to detect abuse, and APIs even we could reuse online, but usually they target specific types of abuse, and there is little overlap between their scope. So let's dig deeper into the terminology. Now I'm showing the Tower of Babel, and I think that's really our problem here. In the Tower of Babel, humans were punished by gods and lost their ability to understand each other. And context, we have different context and different community and different cultures. And this is what makes terms abusive or not. It depends on what was the discussion around those terms. For instance, I can give the example of monkey. If I'm talking about those cute monkeys in Japan that base in hot water spring, that is very nice. But if I'm calling somebody a monkey, that is a totally different story. The term nigger is also interesting because in some cases it is used as a regular term without any intent to harm, or even is not interpreted as harmful, and in other cases it is. And other innocent term in daily life could be adjective that would be praises in some context, like, oh, you're clever. And in other contexts, it could be, especially with irony, it could mean something completely different, like, well, you're not clever, no women are clever, for instance. Let me not demonstrate that right now. So another problem with the terminology is that it evolved through time, and it changes quite fast. It changes as long as memes come and go on the internet. And slang is invented and forgotten and revived regularly through different time frame. It can be a new term a new term can take over very rapidly in a couple of weeks. Some others take years to spread through communities. Then some terms are reappropriated or reclaimed by the community they target. So instead of having those terms being only negative, they use it themselves in their own context and with their own meaning to take over this semantic and reframe the words and their identities. So, for instance, the word nigger, like I was mentioning, if said by a black person, it's reappropriated, for instance. And then queer used to be an offensive term, and it became more neutral, maybe not for everybody, but much more than before. And then the term bitch, for instance, some women can claim that as a way to empower themselves, maybe as a way to make humor as well. And then there can be messages where there is no abusive term at all mentioned in the tweet. It can be really everyday language, especially with irony, like I was saying earlier. You could have a message mentioning you are not clever, and it would be really hard to detect because each word in itself, or if the sentence is short, it's just a few words that could be common language. It makes it even harder. And finally, there can be different spellings for those terms, especially slang, and the spellings evolve too. And there can be misspellings, and it makes it harder to have a lexicography, which means a dictionary of what is an offensive term. So, for instance, if you misspell like by using a K as the first letter, it becomes an offensive term, and if you misspell count by forgetting the O as well, it becomes something offensive. So that's the difficulty with the terminology, and there are difficulties with having consistent ground truth data as well, partly because of the terminology that can vary depending on the community and the platforms. It's also difficult to manage the length of messages because some platforms like Twitter have short messages and others allow for longer messages. And that has a big impact on the kind of technology we could use to detect abuse. Some tech will not work on short messages, for instance. Then the different classes of abuse vary among data sets. Sometimes annotators have just labeled abuse or not abuse. Sometimes it's not abuse, it's sexism or not sexism. Sometimes it's hate speech. So there are different classes of abuse in themselves, and then each data set can target specific classes of abuse. And then annotators, they can have different level of expertise. They might have been trained on how is abuse defined, how to set the limits between what is provocation and what is harmful. And they might have different intentions, those annotators. Are they scientists that have the intention just to develop some data set and some tech, or are they more activist? Are they more personally motivated? And they can be given different criteria to detect abuse. So one data set was made, for instance, with different criteria for the severity of abuse. Another data set would also target less severe abuses. And then each annotator is a human, and we all have a subjectivity. Like I said, some of us have thicker skin and will not consider something offensive that others would. And then something quite difficult with the existing ground truth data is that they have different class sizes. So how many samples per class, how many examples of abuse we have, how many examples of not abuse do we have. And those class sizes may not be balanced. Sometimes the data sets are designed to have balanced class sizes, which means all classes have roughly the same number of samples. But others are randomly sampled, and for instance, so they would reflect what's the proportion of abuse in the platform in general. So they tend to have very much fewer examples of abuse than non-abuse. So here is some example of some data sets that are from a paper from Rosa et al. In last year. It's a systematic reviews of 19 systems and data sets, if I remember correctly. And we can see already something interesting is that here we have a mention of the inter-rater reliability. So that means how much did humans agree that a message was abusive or not? And most papers do not report that, and some report quite a high number, 0.9, and another much lower number, 0.7. And so it's hard to judge the quality or the of the data sets without this metric, and it's also hard to judge the uncertainty in abuse detection itself. And then this column is also quite interesting. So in this paper from Rosa et al., they have defined criteria for cyberbullying. And so it's repetition, so it's repetitive messages. It's aggressive. It has the intention to hurt, and it's between peers in the same community. And we can see how many of this data set had similar criteria, and it varies from 3 to 0. So this can show how different can the definition of abuse be among annotators and among researchers that want to study them and build systems to detect it. And that's another set of aspects about those data sets. And I want to point at the platforms that they target. Some are on MySpace, YouTube, Twitter, Ask.fm, we have Instagram, and so on. So each platform you could have different communities and different lengths of messages. And finally, the balance between the classes. So that would be the proportion of abusive messages in the total number of messages in the ground truth. And we can see that it's generally low in those cases, as low as not even 1% in one case, in some cases. So there is a big variability of data sets. And for our project, we focused on 6 of them, primarily because they all target Twitter, except one data set, the last one that targets a platform called Gab, but we included it because the messages have roughly the same length as Twitter messages. Then we selected this data set also because actually they were relatively easy to obtain online. So some data sets are not ready to download. You should write the authors. But these ones we had not much issues. And finally, a third criteria for us to choose those data sets is that there were instructions given to annotators, and the definition of abuse were relatively coherent with each other. Although I want to point in the classes, so the labels that were given, that we can see that some had only 2 classes, like the last data set, and some had several classes, and some had classes that represented different types of abuse, like racism and sexism, is different kinds. Some would detect just racism or sexism, or both. So that's called multi-label classification, when you can detect several labels. And some would consider classes for the different level of abuse, like offensive and hate speech. In the third data set, offensive is less abusive than hate speech. And in the data set before the last, we had even 3 levels: hateful, abusive, and spam. And finally, those data sets have different class balances, and some have just some hundreds of examples of abuse, which is relatively low. So that's also something to consider if we want to merge all those data sets. We might also need to have types of abuse that have sufficient examples to not be too much of a minority class, and because that could bias the classifiers. But that again, it depends on the technology we would use for classification. Some classifiers like regressions or things based on Bayesian statistics. Sometimes if you have too few examples of abuse, like 4% or 6% in two data sets that we have, it can have the consequences that abuse are generally not detected, sometimes not detected at all. So that's, and to finish on the different class of abuses that we could target, like I said, some are about the types and some are about the intensity. And there is this interesting paper that makes a mix of classes of abuse that reflects the type and the intensity. Here we have 3 levels of intensity, class 1, class 2, and class 3, and inside each of them you can see more labels that represent more types of abuse. And of course, all this is subject to disagreement and interpretation. So in our case, we had to make our own interpretation, and sometimes the reasons for deciding of which class of abuse we would detect, sometimes the reasons are purely material or technological. Sometimes we can't have enough examples. Sometimes the classifiers, even if we have a lot of examples, it doesn't work well for certain types of abuse. For instance, we can make classifiers that work well for racism but not sexism, and end up targeting only racism and not sexism. So it can send the wrong message when you have a system that detects only some types of abuse, because it can be interpreted as like, okay, those are the most important. So that's one more thing we have to be careful about, is if we detect different types of abuse and focus only on some of them, that should not be seen as if the others would be all right. So now we talked about the data sets, and I'm going to say a few things about how can we build models using those data sets. We have several questions to ask again before we start implementing models. Do we want to do binary, multi-class, or multi-label classification? In our case, we started with binary classification because we had too little time to develop proper classifiers for specific types of abuse. And in reusing the existing data sets, some data sets had classes for milder abuse, so to say, like this is offensive or spam, but not hate speech. And in our case, we considered them as not abuse. Then we also had the option of using a single model or multiple models, or using pre-trained models or build our own models. So we kind of tried something in the middle by building a pipeline of algorithms. And it's not exactly ensemble learning, but we used different algorithms and we combined them in different ways. So first, we used pre-trained models from a perspective API that can label different sentiments in the abuse, and 14 of them, and plus 2 more classes. And we use that to extract features to define our tweets better, and then add those features in the input for models that we would train. And we trained our own models using the text in the ground truth data sets that were available, and extra features that were drawn from Perspective API. And then we built several classifiers. We experimented with different technologies, like based on Bayesian statistics, based on decision trees and regressions. And we decided to use several classifiers and have some form of rule to take the final decision on whether a tweet is abusive or not. And those rules were based on some numerical measures. So the level of so the emotions the level of emotion as detected by the perspective API as well as some threshold on the classifier's parameter. In the end, in most of our trials, we found out that having majority ruling would give the best results. So we classified the tweet as abuse if the majority of our models would classify it as abuse, and we had 6 models. We also had rules for the initial decision of running our models. And I'm going to come back on those rules, but basically it's very simple rules to make sure that we don't have too large of a target. So we talk back only to the abusers, not to people who commented it. And we needed to detect specific slang, specific racial slur. So we started by scraping tweets that would only contain a set of racial slur that we found from a database of racial slur. And then we checked that the tweets were also targeting a person in particular. So we had some rules also to avoid that we detect abuse that are not abuse, and that we have too many false positive in our results. And well, once we have some model, we always have to wonder, what is the uncertainty in this model? Is it a castle of cards that will blow up at the first time we use it? So a big question we can ask for classification is, how do we balance false positive and false negative? So in our case, a false positive is when there is a message that is not abusive and we detect it as abusive. And false negative is when there is a message that is abusive and we do not detect it. And in our case, we wanted to avoid false positive, even if it comes at the cost of having a larger number of false negative, because we do not want to engage with innocent messages and potentially do harm by having our chatbot sending messages that are inappropriate because they might be aggressive if the person had not done anything wrong and is called a racist, for instance. Then we have to wonder, can we interpret our model? Can our model give us some score that represent the uncertainty? And in our case, we had rules and classification pipelines that should be relatively easy to explain and interpret. I mean, if you compare them to neural networks, for instance. But with this pipeline, and because we had the majority voting, for instance, we did not provide a numerical measure of how severe or how probable or how certain is the abuse. We could, of course, it's just a matter of having more time to work on it. But that makes it a little bit more difficult to evaluate the quality of our system. And then we can wonder, do we want human in the loop? Do we want, and for instance, end users might want to control what are the rules or the thresholds for detection, to have their own classifier react to what they want a chatbot to react to. And we can also think of having people manually triggering the chatbot once an instance of abuse or potential abuse is detected. So that ends my speech about the technology we could use to detect abuses. And now our next step was to design the dialogue once we detect abuse. So I told you about 3 initial strategies, and we're gonna rethink them. We expanded them by looking at literature, and we found very interesting literature on counter speech, which say that we must match hateful speech with a positive speech that counter the negative impact. So here are 2 examples of an example of how to respond with more positive speech that would express more positive things, like, oh, you're free to express yourself. It's a positive thing, but there are also and then praise, say positive things about the people who were targeted by abusers. And based on this literature, it inspired us several new strategies. So one would be to label abuse and respond and in inappropriate terms and respond to that specifically. Other strategies would be warning to abusers by telling them about the consequences of abuse, which is similar to the initial idea of deterring abusers. And then we could develop empathy by having messages that refer to human emotions, the emotions of the victims, of course, but also of the abusers. Then we could also work on the sentiment of affiliation of abusers. So that's to come back on what psychologists have observed, that sometimes abusers feel that the environment is hostile against them. So maybe we can give them a sense of belonging and showing that we are not hostile to them. And finally, humor, to provide some relief in the tension. So those are the 5 strategies that we experimented with. And to design the dialogues for each of those strategies, we have struggled a bit, of course, and we ended up having a short hack and a long hack. So let me tell you about the quick hack. The quick hack is to have dialogues with just 4 replies that were predefined and independent of what abusers would reply in between. And we made those dialogues ourselves for each strategy. We did implement some entity recognition to mention terms, the abusive terms that were in the abuser's messages. So for strategies with labeling, and we also targeted only one-to-one interaction. So only abusers directed as a victim, and we talked only to the abusers to avoid talking to too many innocent people. And finally, we did not try to impersonate humans yet. For now, we started a short experiment with a bot being clearly a bot. And I can show you an example of how that might look like. So that's to develop empathy, for instance. So you start by saying, oh, you know, it can really hurt people, and try to empathize with what the abusers think. Okay, you might think it's not a big deal, like maybe you don't know. And then try to have the abusers be at the place of the victims and ask them, for instance, if they would say that to people in person. And what would they, if they would expect people to reply to what they have said. So for a quick hack, we needed also to have a measure to evaluate how successful were our strategies. And because we didn't have a measure to detect the severity of abuse, for instance, so are abusers responding with less severe messages, we considered user engagement with how many tweets and retweets and likes and replies or dialogues had. But after all, even if we had a numerical measure of how severe our abuse is, severity decreasing, and even if we have perfect measures of user engagement, this is not enough yet to evaluate the impact of chatbots. We should also check what is the frequency of abuse. We could have cases where there is no engagement, no reply to our chatbots, but maybe that abusers will be less abusive in the future. So we need to monitor maybe the past and future tweets of abusers. So here are some initial results. It's a very, very small experiment with just 230 tweets in total. But we can already see, okay, it's very small numbers, but there are some different behaviors. So for instance, the warning tweets and deter people with the consequences at no reply at all, no likes. But that might still mean it can still have had an impact if later there is less abusive tweet. And then the messages that mention emotion and empathy had more likes than others. And the messages that refer to affiliation and giving a sense of belonging to abusers, like we're not total enemies, these had more text replies by the abusers. So now it's time for a bonus, and I'm gonna end my talk as well with this. Is that we had a long hack. Our long hack was to design a tool for designing the dialogues. Because there could be a variety of social norms and personal values, and maybe every one of us should have an opinion on what those dialogues should be. So our team made a board game for everyone called Botopoly, and participants can experiment with instances of abuse and how they could potentially respond to it. And it's designed to enable the collective reflection on what should be those dialogues. It also allows everyone to practice those dialogue and develop empathy for victims, but abusers as well, and do that in a safe environment of a board game instead of real life Twitter war. And so here are some images of how it looks like. It looks like a Monopoly. Oh, and the name is Botopoly for bot, Monopoly with bot. So the characters can roll a dice and fall on having an experiment having abusers sent to them, and how they're gonna respond to that. Sometimes they could be the abusers themselves, and there are a series of cards that could give them means to respond or means to be the abusers. And some responses can be abused themselves. So here's a very nice insult, and those belong to actual tweets, so you would reply with actual people's tweets. And so this is an example of people interacting with this chatbot. I'll let you imagine what they're telling each other, looking at their face. And so that's to conclude my talk. Besides inviting you to play our Botopoly while being locked down. So in reality, we got kicked out of Twitter, so that's another difficulty. Our chatbot became abusive. And we had cases where we really misinterpreted messages and we overreacted, and we had abusers giving us, potential presumed abuser giving us a lecture on freedom of speech. So all that to say that there's a lot more research needed, and be very happy to hear your thoughts about it.
Very interesting, Emma. Really. I also heard your other talk the other time with the gang. The way you bring certain things, it's like things I would never think about. And even here in this case again, you really need to be careful of what is abusive messaging, because some words might be used in slang, or might be positive and for other people. So that's really interesting. Is there anywhere where we can find that Botopoly game?
So that's a good question. We made our own prototype ourselves. We'd love to find a distributor to have proper prints of it. But if you'd be interested, do send me a message, because we can put that higher in a priority of the things that we work on. And if you have a business in games and you want to edit that, then please come talk to us.
Yeah, it sounds like quite some fun to play it.
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially when in your hand you have really harsh cards, and like it makes people react a lot.
Well, we don't have any questions. We have thank yous from people who really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you too.
That's always nice. I would say, but you answered the question already. Can we try that bot somewhere? But it was on Twitter, but it was taken down, or it's still somewhere online.
Yeah, it's just the board game is not online, but our code.
The Twitter.
Yeah, this is online. I will send my slides again through Twitter, for instance, and I will include the link where you can find our code. But keep in mind that this was a short project, and also one thing I could say about how we work and why we work like this. We do a lot of experiments. We let our trainees to try things, and sometimes what we aim at is more about training the people to master the technology than developing new technologies ourselves. So the prototype we make, you shouldn't expect industry grade coding, but it is very well done still. We had really bright trainees for this project.
It's research, yeah? So
yes,
it's not built to put it in production. Still, you gain the knowledge to build something like that.
Yeah.
All right, Emma, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you too.
For the slides. For our next AI talk, we are going to the US. We're going to the University of Alberta, where we will have, sorry, I've written down his name and now I forgot. How bad is that? He's called Matthew Guzdiel. He's an associate professor at the University of Alberta, and he will be talking about creativity within AI and if AI could build a game, for example. Also really interesting. So hope we see you then. It will be at 7 p.m. same time, but USA Mountain Time. So that's for the people here in Europe. It's I think it's 1 Greenwich time, AM. So if you really want to watch it live and you want to ask questions, yeah, then you will need to join then. But just as every other talk, this will be recorded and you can watch it afterwards. So thank you everyone for watching and hope to see you next time. Bye.